Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. This is our class in collaboration with Vermont Law and Graduate School on how to separate your business from your personal life. As mentioned, we are recording this workshop so that it can live on our YouTube and be a resource for folks for years to come. We ask you to mute yourselves when you're not speaking and to make sure that your name appears in the Zoom window. Looks like everyone's does. When you have questions, please throw them into the chat. Simeon Geigel, one of our microbusiness counselors, and I will be checking the chat and making sure those get attended to. After the workshop, we'll make sure you receive an email with contact information for both our program as well as Vermont Law and Graduate Schools, links to other resources that are mentioned throughout the presentation, and a copy of the presentation itself. Without further ado, I will pass it off to my colleague, Simeon.
Thank you, Sophia. Welcome, everybody. So glad you could make it. I always personally learn a lot from these classes myself, and I guess this topic really resonated with people because we have a good turnout for it. But I'd like to, again, welcome everybody. Just give you a quick introduction to the Micro Business Development Program. We are a statewide program that works with low to moderate income Vermonters to help them start or expand a business. There's no fee for our services. For those that meet our income eligibility guidelines. So if you're interested in accessing our services, please feel free to reach out to us. You can see my name and contact information below, as well as our other business counselor, John Gergley. And this information will be supplied to you in an email from Sophia at the conclusion of our class today. So you don't have to worry about writing this down now. But we would welcome any inquiries, of course. Yeah. So just a quick thank you to some of our partners that helped to promote and put these presentations on. I'd like to thank the People's Trust, specifically Jay Cummings, the business development advisor at People's Trust Company in St. Albans. They offer a variety of commercial and business banking products and services, as well as business consulting services to help their clients succeed. They also offer their own classes, which I have attended, and would strongly encourage anybody that's interested in additional classes to reach out to the People's Trust and Jay Cummings if you'd like to get information about those classes that they run. Next slide. Of course, we'd also like to thank the economic development corporations that represent different areas of our region, the Lake Champlain Islands, Franklin County, Addison County, and the Greater Burlington Industrial Corporation for helping to promote our classes and be a part of our process. I mentioned that microbusiness is a statewide program. It was started back in 1988, so we've been around for a while. And each microbusiness oversees a different set of counties. You can see Brock there. So if you are living in the Bennington-Rutland area, Brock would be the point of contact for you. If you live in Washington, Lamoille, East, or West Orange counties, Capstone would be the microbusiness you'd reach out to. CVOEO, my program, covers Chittenden, Franklin, Grand Isle, and Addison County. If you're up in the Northeast Kingdom, in Caledonia, Essex, or Orleans, NECA is the point of contact. And finally, for Wyndham and Windsor folks, the point of contact there would be Chris Meyer at SEVCA. And if you'd like additional information about microbusiness and to specifically identify counselors in those regions, you can just access the mbdp.org email you see below there. Finally, I do like to mention the other business development support services in our region that we very often collaborate with. And so I encourage everybody to take advantage of their strengths and skills for your business. In Burlington, there's the Burlington Business and Workforce Development Program. There's the Center for Women in Enterprise, Mercy Connections, which operates the Women's Small Business Program. The Vermont SBDC, Vermont Small Business Development Center. The Small Business Administration is obviously a government program and not specifically in our region per se, but you can see that they have a website, so they cover the country. And then finally, Champlain Valley SCORE is another great resource for business development. And I
Okay.
think, yep, I think I'm going to hand it off here to Brian Bailey from the Vermont Small Business Law Center. Thanks, Brian, for sharing all your wisdom and information. And I turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, Simeon. I will share my screen. Um, Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming out today. So, our goal and prompt for the day is separation of business and personal. And we're coming to you from the Vermont Small Business Law Center, the SBLC, which is hosted by Vermont Law and Graduate School. And so, when we think about this concept of how do we separate business from personal, we're going to talk more about that, but we're coming at this from a sort of legal perspective. And really, it comes down to a question about, well, how do we separate the risks and the legal implications of running a business from the person, right? And so I think this is actually a really nice prompt, and it gave us kind of the opportunity to really get into some topics that I think are maybe underappreciated that are really important for small business owners. So who are we? I'm Brian Bailey, as mentioned before. I'm staff attorney at the Small Business Law Center and the clinic at VLGS. We also have two of our students with us today. Nick Renna is a 3L studying for a JD, and Teresa Keller, who I think is not quite here yet, but should be here any second, is also studying with us for a master's. So those two, Nick and Teresa, are going to take point on a lot of this, and I'm just going to come in and offer some additional color and commentary. But our basic agenda is what you see here, right? So we're going to talk about enterprise and entity basics, right? So when we think about a legal entity, what do we mean by that? Usually it's LLCs, right, and other things. We'll talk about that. Debt and assets, keeping those things separate, right? And those are two sides of the same coin, right? So when we think about the balance sheet of a business, or for that matter, of an individual, you've got the sort of debts on the negative side of the balance sheet, you've got the assets on the positive side. Hopefully the positive outweighs the negative. It doesn't always, or it doesn't. Sometimes it tips back and forth across the 0 point. And we'll talk about how we keep those things separate. Operating agreements. This is a big one that's missing for a lot of folks. We do tons of educational consults with small business owners, such as yourselves. And many of them have LLCs. LLCs have a thing called operating agreements. I would say the vast, large, huge majority of LLCs for small businesses and single member LLCs have missed this step, and it's an important one, so we'll talk about it. And then we can also talk about nonprofits, and we'll be interested to know if any of you out there are interested in a nonprofit, have a nonprofit, or want to have one. And sort of hybrid entities. There are some other businesses that are kind of not the LLC model, not the nonprofit model, something more in the middle. We're going to talk about that. And then more broadly, risk and liability, reporting, and sort of regulatory stuff. And then kind of an interesting one, what about when you go into business with friends, or for that matter, family? We can sort of talk about some of the moving parts there. Before we get into the sort of substantive slides, I want to say, I know everyone is invited to put stuff into the chat, put questions into the chat. I will try to keep an eye on that, but I know also Sophia is going to watch it, and Simeon. By all means, ask questions as we go. We're happy to have sort of an open and free-form conversation with you guys here today. So, we will hold some time at the end for Q&A. And so it's fine to wait until the end, but it's also fine to get those questions in the chat as we go. And we're very happy to sort of engage with you all and skip the topics that are alive for you and that are relevant to your businesses. All right, so with that, we can jump in. I think Nick's going to get us started.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk to everyone. business law is a really fun thing that as a law student and a law student looking at graduation, I didn't realize I'd be interested in, but all of a sudden I was like, whoa, business law is really cool. And it can be really helpful, especially for individuals or partners in a business venture or an enterprise to get into. So I'm just going to jump right in with kind of a basic definition of an enterprise. What is an enterprise? Generally, like a person or a few people have a great idea and they want to put it into motion. That is something we can call as an enterprise. The dictionary definition of it is a project or undertaking that is difficult or what requires effort. And as I'm sure everyone here knows, whether your business is just an idea or it's up and running, it is likely a source of some difficulty and perhaps has required effort altogether. So that's one of the reasons why we're really happy to be here today to kind of help sort through foreseeable difficulties and efforts that are worth putting into a business venture. Entrepreneurs in an enterprise are the people who bring it together. And generally, people have different skills, different resources that they bring in, sweat equity or hard capital, cash to help with funding, different resources that really go into this idea that becomes reality, as we know as an enterprise. Generally, there are two basic models. There's a for-profit enterprise and there's a nonprofit enterprise. And we're going to go into the differences between two. One of the biggest differences is whether or not the enterprise can make money and keep money and pay additional money to the people who run it. But when it comes to for-profit enterprises, there's a lot of different styles and a lot of different models that provide pros and cons kind of in equal measure. And so it's a really good thing to keep in mind what goals do you have? What at the end of the day do you want your enterprise to satisfy or complete? And as I said, there are many different entity types, especially for the for-profit models. So unless there are any questions regarding this kind of like broad overview, we can dive into those entity types.
I don't see any in the chat. I
Excellent.
think that's a good overview. So let's get into some details and see what that takes us.
All right. So I don't want folks to be misled by this chart. This chart is actually a much larger and dynamic thing. I've tried to reduce things down to kind of the most basic fundamentals. We have on the left side the types of businesses, sole proprietorships, LLCs, etc. We have in the middle government requirements. So you can kind of see like each has like high levels of reporting or low levels of reporting. That can be a pro for some people and a con for others. And then taxes, because anytime there's money with anything, taxes are involved. But please know that there's a lot more to this, and I'm going to try and articulate some of that just to give you an overview of the different dynamics. So we're going to start with a sole proprietorship. So in terms of keeping business and personal life separate, a sole proprietorship is the least advantageous. It is the worst model to keep business and personal life separate because a sole proprietorship is basically a single person with a business. There is no, at least from a legal perspective, there is no difference between the individual and their business. One of the pros to this is that there are very little government requirements. You don't have to report or register with the Secretary of State. You don't have to have, but from a legal standpoint, really any documentation of what you're doing because you and your business are one entity. And for tax purposes, that's also kind of easy because anything that the business makes is like taxed. You are taxed, no, not as anything separate than your business. So any income from the business is your personal income to report in on taxes. We go next into a partnership, which requires at least 2 people or a person and another business as like separate legal entities. And a partnership likewise has low government requirements. A partnership can be formed just with like, hey, buddy, you want to make a sandwich shop? And from a legal perspective, a partnership can very readily be formed in that way. So it's a persnickety, somewhat organic way of going about things, but there are laws that kind of provide a filler for if there is an unspoken agreement between partners and there's a conflict. The law says like, well, if you wanted to share profits in certain ways, like this is what the law says you can do because you didn't arrange that ahead of time. We'll kind of go more into partnerships nitty-gritty a little bit later, but likewise, a partnership can be a very low effort venture, I guess, in its formation, because it can be something as simple as, hey, buddy, you want to start a sandwich shop. And so because of that relatively low government requirement, there's also a similar taxation system as to the sole proprietorship. Anything that the partnership makes, any income is personal income and it's passed through. I realize I didn't define that term of pass through. It's essentially like you have your sole proprietorship or you have your partnership, and the taxes just pass immediately through that legal distinction of a partnership to each individual partner to report on their personal tax returns. The next entity, and we're going to get a little bit more technical, I guess, or to a certain degree, is a limited liability company. So a limited liability company is kind of what it purports to be, what it says. It limits the personal liability of the owners who create it. And because of this shield, which we'll also talk about the shields and what we call the corporate veil in a little bit, this shield requires a little bit more information to the government, because what you're creating with a limited liability is essentially a separate legal entity. It's either an individual person saying, I want to have a business that is distinct and separate from myself, or a group of people who say, I want to have a business that is distinct and separate from ourselves. And they create a limited liability company, which they have to register with the Secretary of State. Because if something happens and people want to shield their own personal assets and their own personal what have you, sorry, the train is coming by. So if you hear the train or my dog snoring, I apologize for that. It's a little noisy over here. But you need to register with the Secretary of State with a limited liability company, because there's something else that's going to hold the liability, that's going to hold any debt that another person wants to enforce. And say there's a contract between the company and a supplier for, we'll go with the sandwich shop, a supplier for bread, and the company decides, we don't want this anymore. There was a contract, we don't want this anymore. And the bread supplier is going to say like, well, you kind of have to pay me. A limited liability company provides a shield for the people who own it, because the supplier is going to go and say like, hey, company, you have to pay me. And I hope I'm explaining this at least a little bit properly, but we'll clarify it a little bit more. But as I said, there's a medium requirement when it comes to medium level of intensity requirement when it comes to reporting to the government. You have to register with the Secretary of State, just so that they know that there's something else that is involved, that another entity that is at play, rather than just like Joe and Josephine who run the sandwich shop. From a taxation perspective, there are 2 options. There's that pass-through of anything that the LLC makes is my personal income, or me and my fellow owners' personal income, and we're going to report it as such. There is also a caveat where an LLC can opt to have corporate taxation, which is kind of a form of double taxation. It seems unappealing for many people, but it can be helpful when it comes to the amount of self-employment taxes that members or owners of an LLC have to pay. We're not going to go too far into that, but it is good to know that there are different taxation styles depending on kind of the needs of the company and needs of the owners. And while we won't go too much into corporations or anyone else, I'll just touch on them briefly. A corporation is kind of a step beyond in complexity with beyond a limited liability corporate company. My goodness. In that one of the main factors of a corporation is it allows for more funding, more external funding. That's when you get into realms of having shareholders who buy stock from a company. With that, there's additional government requirements. There's, for instance, a requirement that the corporation have a board of directors to oversee everyone who the primary people who operate the company. Apologies. And that has corporate taxation as well. The purpose of a corporation is generally to make money for its shareholders. That is kind of the purported mission of a corporation, no matter what it is doing. And there are some folks who want to have that mission to make money for shareholders, but also to provide some sort of benefit. And so there is a legal carve out for that to kind of protect the officers and the board of directors of a corporation from being sued by their shareholders saying, you didn't make me as much money as you could. Well, Benefit Corporation allows people to say, we want to make money, but we also want to give back to the environment. We also want to implement certain standards of business procedure. A nonprofit is another entity type, and we'll go far more into detail with that later, but we'll just say that it does have a lot of government requirements because a nonprofit cannot make profits to retain for itself, as in the people who run the nonprofit cannot make more than a reasonable salary from working at the nonprofit. The money can go back into programming, but it can't be willy-nilly paid out because fundamentally a nonprofit sources most of its funding from outside people who are giving their money away. So the government wants to make sure that money is being spent and allocated for the purpose of the nonprofit, which from a federal perspective is a charitable purpose, scientific purpose, anything along those lines. And one of the benefits of that massive oversight from the government is that it is exempt from income tax, which kind of allows a nonprofit to do a little bit more than it would otherwise be able to do. And then we're not going to talk too much about co-ops because those are a little bit more complicated. But if you have questions, I'm sure Brian would be able to touch at least a little bit better on co-ops than me. Do we have any questions at this juncture?
I don't see any in the chat, but I will invite everyone to maybe put in the chat if you have a business organization already set up, and if so, what kind is it? And particularly, I'm interested if anyone does now or intends to run a nonprofit, because we can tailor our comments. We're going to cover all this, but we can emphasize things that are relevant to the group. Yulia's got a question now. Yulia, have at it.
Thank you. So can you go a little bit more specific about what the difference between pass-through and self-employment is, or is it synonymous?
It is.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, you can go, Brian. You go for it.
Okay, so yeah. So self-employment is, I think, a little bit of a red herring there. Basically, what we have is two kinds of taxation. One is pass-through, which just means that the income made by the organization goes on to the personal income tax return of the owner or the owners of those multiple. As compared to corporate tax, where the organization pays its own taxes and the individuals who receive money from the business also pay income on the money that they've received. That's that double taxation piece. when we think about employment, that goes a little bit more with like the corporate taxation, because the way this usually works is we get, like, think of it in let's just talk about a single member LLC for a second, right? Because that's a really common form. The single member LLC, let's say it makes $10,000 over the course of the year. The default for an LLC is pass-through taxation, which just means that $10,000 of income that was made by the company goes on to the 1040, right? That form we all file about this time of year, each year. It goes onto a schedule, actually called Schedule C, and that's where the owner would say, I have a business, the business made $10,000 extra income on top of whatever else was made through a W-2 or investments or whatever other things. But the owner can also be an employee of the organization. So the owner can make a salary from the organization, can become, in fact, a W-2 employee of the organization. It's possible to do this. And now we start, and either way, the owner is going to be paying self-employment taxes, right? So there's the unemployment tax requirements and so forth. It gets pretty complicated pretty quick, which is why we say see an accountant for a lot of this stuff. But for today's purposes, what I'll say is that the default position is that LLC will be a pass-through organization, but it can switch. And by the way, it can switch back and forth. It's not super hard to do. And whether it should be one or the other, and whether the owner should be an employee, not an employee, that all has to do with how much money the business is making, what the tax situation of the owner is with respect to the rest of their life, and all that stuff, right? And that's where an accountant can come through, look at your situation and say, actually, you should become an employee. Maybe you should, create deals with yourself. We're going to talk more about sort of the person, the human versus the entity. There can be agreements even in a single member LLC, and sort of rearrange things for your particular tax situation.
Okay.
Does that
Thank
make
you
sense?
for collaboration. Yeah, definitely.
Brian, can I follow up with you on
Yeah.
that just for a quick sec, just for my own understanding? So when you say that if you're an LLC and somebody can switch, are you talking about forming an S corporation? Is that what you're talking about there?
So, yeah, good question. So when we think about LLCs, we've got that default rule that says it's going to be a pass-through entity. When we look at corporations, which can be C corporations or S corporations, S being the more common one for small businesses. The S corporation has a default where it will be taxed as a corporation and not a pass-through entity. Both of those can be switched the other way around though. And when you do the switch, you're not actually changing your corporate form. You're just telling the IRS, I want to go away from the default if you're an LLC and be taxed as a corporation. Or if you're an S corp, you can say, I want pass-through taxation. And you can switch back and forth. That's just a form you file with the IRS, and you can go back and forth as you need to. It's a lot harder to actually change your corporate form. Like if you are an LLC and you want to become an S corp for some reason, that's possible to do. It's a lot harder though. But if you just want to change your taxation status, that's just a form.
Okay, thanks. And just a point of clarification too, when you're Nicole, when you were speaking about the sole proprietor and not needing to register with the Secretary of State, but am I correct in that if you wanted to use an assumed business name, you would need to go to the Secretary of State? So rather than your own name, you wanted to name your business something specific, you would need to go through them in order to be allowed to do that.
I believe so. Brian, you can confirm.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a DBA, right? You can register with the Secretary of State to say, I am me, but I'm doing business as whatever my name for the business is. I don't think the Secretary of, I don't think that there's risk exposure for failing to register a DBA. in terms of like the Secretary of State saying, you may not call yourself that. But when you register as a DBA, you secure that name. It prevents somebody else from registering that very same name, Secretary of State. It can have other benefits. But all you're doing is telling the Secretary of State, I'm out there doing business. This is the name of my business that I use. But it doesn't create that limited liability shield. It doesn't create the separate
Right.
legal entity that would help.
Great, thank you, appreciate it.
Something I failed to mention around taxes, at least for sole proprietorships and partnerships, is that when it comes to filing taxes, of course, it's still passed through and albeit a red herring of self-employment. You can register with the IRS for an employer identification number, which for liability reasons, for the legal protections of separating oneself from their business, an employer identification number or EIN is not particularly useful from that protective measure, but it can be useful for taxation purposes and business write-offs, essentially, for your business. So not to get too much in the weeds with that, but looking up EIN with the IRS and registering, it's a pretty simple process, and it can be helpful in at least separating the books in the interim or long-term if a sole proprietorship or partnership model works best. But I also just kind of want to conclude that a sole proprietor and partnership, there is a partnership can have a little bit more structure to it than a sole proprietorship, and probably should, because it requires it entails like having more than one person. So it's always good to have some sort of guiding document or partnership agreement. It can be really helpful, but ultimately the sole proprietorship and all of the partners in a partnership are liable for any debts in particular, or any like complaints with the state, or any, any suits that are brought against a sole proprietorship or a partnership. So that's just good to keep in mind. They're great tools for some types of enterprises, but not the best when it comes to having that protection of oneself and one's assets.
And just a quick note about EINs, those are free. You can get those through the IRS. So if I say that specifically because if you do a search for EINs, you're going to find businesses that come up that will charge you to get it. So don't fall for those. You can get them for free through the IRS. And I just want to point out to Brian and Nicole that it looks like Eula has a question in the chat. If you'd like, I can read it to you, or I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah, I did see that. Thanks, Cindy.
Sure.
Right. So we have a nonprofit organization on the one hand, maybe going to also have an LLC or a B Corp or a co-op. And, what would be the benefits of choosing between those? We're going to talk quite a bit about nonprofits going forward. So I'll refrain from getting too deep into that, other than to say that the nonprofit organization is its own sort of legal beast. It has a very high bar for creating it in the first place. There's sort of an application process that has to be done with the IRS. It's not trivial. It's not small. And then maintaining a nonprofit organization also requires quite a bit of due diligence. It's also, as we'll see, it can be challenging to have a nonprofit organization and a for-profit organization. So when we think about an LLC, a B Corp, a co-op, those are all for-profit organizations. They are allowed to have extra money that they distribute to the owners. Just, hey, dividend. We had a nice quarter. Owners, here you go. Good job, right? Nonprofits, as Nicole mentioned, can pay a reasonable salary. They cannot pay profit. They cannot distribute profits. That's the big difference, right? So that's what the LLC, the B Corp, the co-op can all do, but the nonprofit cannot do. In terms of the difference between those, at a high level, the LLC is the easiest and by far the most common choice. For those who've responded in the chat about, what they have or would like to have, just about everybody says LLC. that's consistent with our observation, right? Most people choose LLCs. There's a reason for that. It's really easy to set it up, and it's really easy to keep it. When we think about corporations, they are a little harder to set up and harder to keep, right? Corporations have to have a board. They have to have officers. They have to have annual meetings. There have to be minutes from those meetings. And that, by the way, also true for nonprofit organizations, which are corporations, just with a special tax status. So, as a practical matter, can a single person have a single member corporation? Yeah, they can. But they still have to sort of go through the motions of doing an annual meeting, even though it's just them, keeping minutes and so forth, in order for everything to be kind of fully. When we think about B Corps, that's just a corporation that has articulated a mission that's separate and apart from making money for shareholders. So it's kind of like a hybrid entity. We're going to talk about that in more detail. And then co-ops, we're going to talk about those too. That has to do with a bunch of people coming together and being co-owners of your organization. But we're going to get into all that. So let's march on here. And Teresa, you're with us now. I think you were going to talk about debt and assets.
Yes, I am. And hello, everyone. I'm Teresa. I also work in a small business law center with Nick and Brian as a clinician. So in order to start diving into not so much the 101 of business entities and talk more specifics, let's start with debt and assets. So a business, whether it's a formal entity that's been registered with the Secretary of State or an informal side hustle, will most likely have costs and will require things to do that job. So in other words, debts and assets. For sole proprietors, we've talked a little bit about that already. The assets are not different from personal assets. So if I have a business where I buy bread from a supplier and I resell that bread, which I think Nick was using as an example, and I decide to stop my business, but I still have that contract, the bread supplier, if I'm the sole proprietor, there is no separation. So they could come after me and say, hey, we just need the debt and my personal assets because I haven't separated and I am the sole proprietor. Those could go against the debts that are held. So it's not just what's being used for the work, but without the protections of other entities, it would go against personal assets. Partnerships and unofficial partnerships are similar. So the personal is entangled with the business. So debts can be collected from the individual partners if the larger business gets into trouble. LLCs, limited partnerships, corporations, these do provide something of a shield. As we mentioned once before, they're separate legal entities. Before we go into the protections, there are things that even that veil can't shield a business owner from. And those are if one of the business owners hurts another person, and that's general wrongdoing or injustice, think of it as, I can't break a few laws and say, oh, well, I have an LLC, so it goes against my business. That's just not going to protect the business owner. If the owner fails to separate themselves, and that's the personal from the business, like using company business bank account to buy new deck furniture for their personal residence, that's not going to protect the business owner in that situation because they are breaking the veil. Or if one of the member owners signs a contract as an individual instead of on behalf of that business, they've also kind of crossed that line and pulled the personal into instead of relying on the business for the protection. It's easy to think about it as if I'm using my personal name, then I'm personally going to be involved. So let's talk more about how the business can be separate from the owner with the next slide. Great. I'll go through this and then we'll open it up for questions after we get through. Perfect. So the person versus the entity, or the entity versus the person. As we've said, limited liability companies, limited partnerships, and corporations provide a limit to the liability of the business owners. So when an LLC files the articles of organization or the corporation files articles of incorporation, they form a separate legal entity. In the eyes of the law, it's like a different person. But the business can only be viewed as that separate entity if they act like a separate entity. This means that for business entities, the business could go bankrupt, but the personal assets like an owner's house can't be viewed as a business asset if it has been kept separate. Creditors wouldn't be able to collect on an owner's personal property, but they would be able to collect against the business. If the business needs to use assets that the owner has in their personal property, there could be a lease. So this is one way to create separation between the person and the business. For example, I'm starting a landscaping business and I'll be using my lawnmower. I bought it before I decided to start this business, but it's something that I have and I'm going to use it. So the business, my LLC, is going to lease that lawnmower from me, the person. There's a contract, there's going to be an exchange, and that creates that separation between the person and the business. It might be for a small amount, so I might only lease it for $5 every month between my business account and my personal, but so long as there is that agreement and then there is, you can think of it as a paper trail, making sure that from an outsider perspective, it does appear as though there is an exchange between two different entities. So it's important to keep separate books or separate track of earnings. Under the limited liability entities, a separate account is going to be needed for the business to maintain that clear distinction. Nick mentioned the EIN, and so that filing for taxes, the EIN is also used to open a specific bank account. So a bank might ask a business owner for an EIN in order to create that specific account, and that again, keeping them in different areas helps keep the separation, keeps that liability shield. So thinking through that how to have these separate books, we're going to talk about habits of the mind. So fulfilling different roles, especially between business and personal, can be tricky. So the first step is to avoid making things murky. If I can't keep track if my actions are for my personal or for my business, how would a judge know? How would a third person be able to interpret how I'm spending my money or spending my time? So it's better to keep track of things and make them as distinct and clear as possible for myself first. One way to do that is by using time tracking. So using a daily planner for specific business activities or recording hours in a spreadsheet. And whether that's at the end of each day or the end of each week, creating that record is one way to make the entity separate from the person. There's also, we like to call it switching hats. And this might be something that we've heard before. But I have a friend who has a small hourly task that she does every week, and she actually has a hat that she puts on whenever she needs to focus on that task. And it also helps her be very mindful of time tracking for that specific event and get into the mentality of keeping that business separate, because she's using her computer for two different jobs really, but wearing the hat is her way to say, yep, I'm going to make sure that this activity is tracked for this business versus the other. It doesn't have to be an actual business hat, but being able to think through, I'm wearing my personal hat for this activity. Oh, and I need to make sure that I take my personal hat off and put on my business hat, can also help personally with the habit of mind of keeping things separate. So we will turn it over to Nick to go into more detail about the corporate veil and covering assets, but are there any questions at this point?
Hi, just Simeon here. So the time tracking component, I guess practically speaking, like what would that look like? You know, if you're switching between various roles during the day, it's just like how in depth do you need to be, and how official does this need to look and feel?
I'll let Brian chime in as well, but from my experience, it's not necessarily about creating a ledger that is leather bound that you can hand off at any moment. It's really making sure that you, as the business owner, are keeping the mentality and are able to differentiate between tasks. If the entity needs to be able to stand on its own, then it needs to have some legs under it, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can add a little bit to that. So it's another tool that can be used to create that separation and be able to show that separation between the individual and the legal person that is created by the individual in the form of an LLC or a corporation, a nonprofit, or whatever. And, I think it's also worth mentioning here that, as with anything, perfection is not the standard, right? So we're not saying, well, there has to, if you accidentally take a check that was written to your business and you deposit it into your personal account, is it like, oh no, jig is up? Now any judgment against the business is coming against my house? No, probably not, right? But if you do a good job at keeping that separation clean and you adopt habits, right? Like time tracking, certainly like having a separate bank account and making sure that both money that's held by the business and the individual are in separate accounts, but also flows of money, right? So when the business gets paid, that goes into the business account, even if it's sort of a formality, right? Because business got paid $1,000. The business doesn't need that 1,000 right now, but I do because I'm paying my mortgage in a few days, right? Why wouldn't I just take the business check and put it in my personal account? No, not a best practice, right? The best practice is take the check, put it into the business bank account where it belongs, and then move it from business bank account to personal bank account. That's called a draw, right? The business is allowed to pay the owners and pay them whenever it wants, right? Whether it's through a salary every 2 weeks or twice a month or whatever, or just through periodic draws where the owner says, oh, I've got extra money in the business account. Great. I'm going to pull that out. That's a draw. I'm going to put it in my personal bank account. I'm just taking profit, right? When you're an owner of an LLC, you get to do that. So, or any other for-profit organization. But it's about keeping it clean. And kind of like what Teresa was saying, I imagine the judge, right? Or the jury who, okay, so let's, we lawyers are catastrophizers and we love to think about how everything can go wrong in the future. And so we imagine, oh boy, the business got sued, something bad happened. There's a judgment now against the business. The judge or the jury has said, yep, you're liable. You owe the plaintiff a bunch of money. And now the owner of the business is trying to say, okay, but you can only collect that against the assets of the business because I've got the corporate veil, right? You can't come after my house, my personal car, my personal bank accounts. Those are mine. It's the business that's on the hook for this judgment, not me, not the individual human. Okay, the plaintiff's attorney is going to say, no, we should pierce that corporate veil. We're going to go after the assets of the individual owners. And now you've got that fight going on in the court about, okay, are the assets of the owner protected or aren't they? Well, so if we put ourselves into that, hypothetical situation, and we're the judge looking at the bank account statements and looking at the records of ownership and looking at what the owner does, and how the business runs and everything, is it clear where the business ends and the personal person begins? Or isn't it? Is it a big jumbled mess, right? Where there's no separate bank account, you can't tell where the money's been coming or going. It's impossible to say what the business owns versus what the person owns because it wasn't kept separate. Well, in situations like that, the judge is maybe going to have no choice but to say, I can't tell who's who, so the person was going to be on the hook to satisfy stuff. And that's what we're trying to avoid. That's where this separation comes in, the time tracking, which hat are you wearing right now? It's all sort of in service of keeping things separate so that if that day ever comes, the personal assets will be protected by the LLC like they should be.
Thanks, Brian. Out of curiosity, I don't know if you're able to provide this or I'm putting you on the spot, but can you provide like a simple example of what somebody would need to do for time tracking? And
You know, it really comes down to being clear about what the business is up to and versus what the individual person is doing, right? And so when we think, and it's a good way of keeping a record where we can say, you know, during these hours, I was, you know, I've got my landscaping business and I'm over here doing landscaping. And today I worked on Joe Smith's house and we did the mowing and rigging and all that stuff. Right. And that happened between 9 and 1. That's a way for a cross reference for all the other things that the business is using, that the business owns. Then subsequent to that, we see a check comes in from Joe Smith, you know, for $100, and we say, oh, well, that must be for that thing in your ledger. Oh yeah, yeah, sure is. Oh, well, the check got deposited into your personal account. Oh, well, oops. But that's okay. It's in the ledger. And we're like, no, no, no. Well, we can see that you did the work over here. And so now, 3 days later, we see that you got paid for the work. Clearly, there's a connection there, right? So it's just a way of kind of memorializing. It's sort of like a journal about kind of here's what we've been up to, here's what we've been doing. That's a way to make it really clear what the business does, and that cross references against the money that the business gets, the assets that the business owns or uses or is leasing from the owner, so that maybe things aren't being done perfectly in every other role, but you can still stitch together what the business is up to versus the person by looking back at those things. It's just it's one way to sort of create that division and make it clear who's who.
thank you, Brian. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I think this segues perfectly into our next slide. Nick, you're up for this, right?
I am
CYA.
covering your assets. Take that in any way you desire. So we've talked a little bit about, or we've mentioned the corporate veil. Corporate veil, what is that? How is that useful? What have you? The corporate veil is essentially a legal shield between the owners of a company and the company itself. And Teresa had mentioned, you know, there's the difference between the person and the legal entity. And so separating these two things are crucial for maintaining this thing called the corporate veil, which is simply a legal, like I said, a legal barrier, kind of protecting the owners, saying it's essentially the business saying, like, I got this, guys. Like, there's this person who has a debt and they're trying to collect. Don't worry, I got it. And so that's the benefit of, say, an LLC or a corporation. It says the term is corporate veil, but it can be applied to any entity structure that is different and separate than the owners themselves. Yulia, I see you have.
Yeah. What's up, Yulia?
I'm just curious if you can speak to what the limits are themselves. Like, how far is the liability limited?
Absolutely. So the liability is fundamentally limited to the business. If the business gets into trouble, it's the business that suffers the consequences of the trouble and not necessarily the owners. The purpose of the corporate veil, and a term we know as like piercing the corporate veil, is when the business and the people, the owners, are not entirely separate. And so an instance where an owner wouldn't be entirely separate from their corporation or their LLC is having a shared bank account. Or let me pull up my notes here. Kind of mixing personal and business finances. So if it's not a shared bank account, then maybe it's making personal purchases, toilet paper, for my household using my corporate bank account. That would be an instance where the business is not really separate from me. I'm using the business for my own personal purposes. And while toilet paper seems a little bit innocuous, think about, you know, an entertainment set, or a new car that is fundamentally for my enjoyment and not for my business, which may have nothing to do with, like, say, a delivery system where a car would come into play. That would be an instance where me as a business owner, I might be abusing the privileges of my business, and abusing that I gotcha guy mentality. Me just assuming that my business will be able to capture any debt that I personally own. So again, taking out, leasing a car and saying I default on my lease personally, but I used it my business to kind of sign the lease, but it's only mine. The dealership might be like, hey, there's something fishy here. I think we should pierce the veil there, pierce the corporate veil, because it doesn't seem like there's any separation between the person, me, who bought the car, or leasing the car, and the business that I'm putting out there to pretend that, or to catch any like liabilities so that I can, at the end of the day, keep the car. Ultimately,
So, yeah, can I add to that? I mean, so
Yeah.
then from there, right, we think about the corporate veil, and let's say it's all getting done right, and the veil is intact. The judgment comes in, and the business owner's done everything right. We'll go back to our landscaper, right? So what does the business own? Well, it's got some bank accounts that are sufficient to cover its, upcoming expenses. Maybe it's got a couple employees, got enough to cover payroll and whatever else, gas for the truck and the vehicle and the equipment. Plus, it owns the truck and a trailer and a bunch of stuff that goes on the trailer, right? They roll up to the house, they take stuff off the trailer. That's all business equipment. So maybe the business has $100,000 worth of stuff, right? Both in accounts and, equipment that it owns. And some terrible thing happens, and they have a judgment against them for $1 million, right? So then the question becomes, well, how much? There's a $900,000 delta here, right? Where the business only owns $100,000, but the judgment's for $1 million. Can the whole 900 be sort of written off, if you will, by the existence of the corporate veil? And the answer is, yeah, if the business has been run well and the corporate veil remains intact, and the judgment can only be leveled against the business and not against the owner, then what ends up happening is the plaintiff gets the $100,000 out of the business, right? The assets get sold, the bank account gets liquidated by the court, or under the court's authority. And the plaintiff gets that 100. And then the business says, well, that's all we had, bankruptcy, right? And now you've got bankruptcy protection. The business is its own legal person. It gets bankruptcy protection just like you and me, just like humans. And so instead of the extra 900 being satisfied by the house, the car, the personal bank accounts of the owner, it's like, well, sorry, business is bankrupt and we're done, right? The owner gets to keep all their stuff. So that's how this looks in person. There kind of is no limit on how much protection that separate legal entity can provide. And the way that looks in practice is bankruptcy is the thing that happens, right? The business liquidates whatever it has, the plaintiff gets. After that, you don't get it because the business is dead. So,
That's super clear. Thank you guys so much.
Oh, sorry, Nicole, just a quick question for Brian on that topic. So practically speaking, if that business had insurance, that would have likely kicked in with the settlement. Is that true or not?
yeah, so we haven't talked about insurance, but that's a whole nother layer of protection. So if we think of the corporate veil as sitting between the owner and the plaintiff, right, or whoever's coming after the business for money, the insurance is a layer of protection that generally is going to sit between the business and the plaintiff, which in turn sits between the owner and the plaintiff. So now you've got two layers: the business on the one hand, the corporate veil, and the insurance on the other, which will generally do two things. One thing that insurance does is it obviously pays the judgment if there is one up to the limit. whatever that may be, right? Because insurance policies usually have limits. But also they'll help you defend. And that's an underappreciated benefit of insurance. The insurance company doesn't want to lose either. And so they will bring their lawyers and their resources to the fund and try not to lose that lawsuit, which can be a really big benefit for small businesses who are set up to take on litigation.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
So as Brian was saying of just like a business owner doing everything within their power to maintain the corporate veil, there are steps to take to maintain the corporate veil or to make the veil as thick as possible, like a thick curtain. You don't want it to be a sheer curtain to let some questionable or questions through. And so just fundamental factors that can help reinforce the corporate veil, this separation between an owner and a business, is just having separate assets and just kind of what Teresa was saying, just fundamentally having a separate hat to put on. And so going to the bank as a business person, or am I going to the bank as myself? Which account am I working with? Which card am I working with? If I'm working out of a space for my personal self, I need to make sure that that is different than if I'm working out of space for the purpose of my business. And in that case, if and Brian might go into this about a home business, I have like a lease with myself if it's in my house. And it's just really helpful because it goes fundamentally to that final point of just document. Having a trail that just shows to anybody, the world, saying like, no, I am separate from my business. And this is how I am fundamentally separate from my business, which allows the business to, again, be that shield to provide that veil for any third party who has beef with the business from preventing that beef to be put onto me or my fellow owners.
Yeah. So, right, we've been talking about like our landscaper, which has turned into sort of a nice example, but we could think about like the home business, right? People can work from home. What about that? What kinds of assets can we separate there? A big one is mentioned right there in the separate assets piece. Space within the home, right, can be leased. So we can think about, okay, I've got my legal person who is my LLC on the one hand, and then there is me on the other hand. Who owns the home? Oh, I do, right? It's the family, my personal place. So I own them, the individual human. But I use it for my business, right? I've got this room where I do all my work. A best practice might be to lease that room from the business. I'm sorry, from the individual to the business, right? And in this way, we've created a legal instrument that says, yeah, I'm the human who owns this space, but business, I recognize that you're using it. I'm going to create a lease that sets out the terms of your use. Because business, you don't own this home and you don't own this room. I do. I'm letting you use it. How does that help? I mean, it can help from a tax perspective, and you can talk to your accountant about that. Sometimes it's worthwhile to actually pay yourself to lease your thing if that makes sense for your tax equation. But more than that, when we think about the liability side, it's removing an argument that the home is actually a business property, right? You could imagine a plaintiff saying, well, but the work gets done out of the home. I want to attach the home to my judgment. I want to go after the home and have it get sold or mortgaged or somehow leveraged to satisfy the judgment. I want to get the money out of the house. That argument gets a lot weaker, if not completely gone, by the existence of the lease, right? Because what the lease essentially says is, no, the business doesn't own any part of the home. Just the human is just letting the business use it. So, yeah, that's a good example of that. All right, so Teresa, think you're up for the next one, yeah?
Yes, we're going to talk about operating
agreements.
agreement.
Oh, yes, the operating agreements that are so often not done. This will be useful for people. I'm sure of it.
Yes. So an operating agreement is specific to an LLC, but there are principles that we'll go through that can be applied to corporations and nonprofits. So an operating agreement can be thought of as a roadmap for the business. Who are the owners or the owner members? Is the business owned by only one person, or are there multiple business owners? Of those owners, what are their responsibilities? Do they hold different roles? How are decisions made? So if there are more than one business owners, do they vote for a big decision? Is it by majority? What happens if there's an equal split? So the operating agreement sets the tone and determines how these situations are going to be handled before they happen. What we see a lot is, as Brian mentioned, businesses don't have operating agreements, and then they get into something sticky, and then they reach out for some legal advice and or education. And a lot of the times we talk about how having an operating agreement as early as possible can help mitigate and understand what's going to happen down the road when things do get sticky. So some other key pieces that could be included in an operating agreement: how the business grows, whether that's through succession planning, bringing in family members, or how different owners can buy other owners out or just bring in more owners. And then also very important is how a business gets closed. What determines that the end of a business entity? How is that determined by the one member or multiple members? And what steps are going to be required in that process? It's important to note that an operating agreement can be changed after it is adopted by the business. There's a process that can be put in there into that roadmap. But it really exists to help a business plan ahead, and is also very important to keep the personal separate from the business. If the operating agreement sets in there what the ownership split is between two individuals and how they're going to make decisions, it becomes a lot harder to point to personal assets or personal actions, because the operating agreement helps create those guide rails earlier on in the process. So before I get into the scenario, Brian, did I miss anything with the importance of operating agreements?
No, that covers it really well. I'll sort of revisit one point that we talked about a little bit before, which is partnerships. So the sort of common law partnership, in that scenario, every partner is on the hook personally for every judgment which could be leveled against the partnership, including for bad things done by the other partner. Right. So this is one that gets missed sometimes, where people are in a partnership by default because they haven't created an LLC and don't have an operating agreement. And one partner does a bad thing. And a judgment comes up against the company as a result of the bad thing with what's done. And then the plaintiff says, I'm going to collect against, the partner who did the bad thing doesn't have any money, and neither does, and the company doesn't have much money. But the partner who didn't do the bad thing, they're collectible. They've got assets. I'll go after them. They get to do that, right? So that's one of the benefits of creating a separate structure like an LLC, and it's one of the benefits that you get from an operating agreement, because it can specify who owns what, who brought what to the partnership, and who's responsible for what parts of the business and so on. Yeah, so you want to go through the scenario? I don't know if you got that.
Sure. Yeah. So in this scenario, it's a general store. The business was started by a married couple. So if we started the business together or the couple started the business after they got married, they did form an LLC. So the default would be, if they didn't define like ownership or responsibilities, it becomes a lot murkier later on. So over the course of the business, one spouse was the manager of daily business, the other is managing supplies. Then they decide to divorce. So what happens to the business? And do we,
Yeah, and that's a sticky one, right? If we have an operating agreement in place, then the agreement is going to say how this goes. Because operating agreements and multi-member LLCs, one of the key things that they do is specify how do members come and go. What happens when a member wants to leave? What happens if a member dies? What happens if a member goes bankrupt person, right? Because that's another significant legal event. The operating agreement is generally going to specify those things and provide a roadmap for how things are going to proceed. In the absence of an operating agreement, though, like it's just a marital asset. We're just looking at statutory rules. And by the way, there are statutory rules that Vermont and other states do this too, set up to govern how partnerships work or how LLCs work for that matter, with respect to other owners and with respect to their relationship to the legal person that is the LLC. The default rules set by the legislature, they're not created with the owner's best interest in mind. That's not the job of the legislature, right? The legislature's job is to protect the taxpayer of the state. So if the business doesn't have an operating agreement, then the legislature will set the rules for you. But don't expect that to be the way you want it to be, because that's not their mandate. But when you create an operating agreement, you can set aside all those default rules or amend them and make the rules yourself. And those are going to be, in general, much friendlier to the owners.
great, thank you.
All right, so we move on.
Brian,
Simeon, you got a question? Yeah.
yeah, just a quick question, maybe a clarification for those watching. It's really quite clear why an operating agreement would be needed for a partnership based on what you just described. But if they are just going to be a one-person LLC, sole member LLC, can you explain like why they would still need an operating agreement?
Yeah, that's a good question. And thank you for that, because
Thanks.
I was thinking about that, but then forgot to bring it up. The big one, there are a few reasons, but there's one big reason. That is called indemnification, which is a big word that means the person giving indemnification will stand in front of the person receiving indemnification and shield that person against the incoming judgment from the plaintiff or whatever legal trouble has happened. So that's in the case of the operating agreement, what that looks like is the business promising to the human, if we all get sued, I'll take the hit, me, the business. You, the human, you're off the hook. So whatever we're doing together, right? And in the case of a single member LLC, it's all one human, but it's two people, right? It's the LLC and the human. And it's the LLC promising to the human that whatever we do together in running our business, if we get sued and something bad happens from a legal perspective, that's on me, the LLC. And I absolve you, human, of all the things, right? No judgment for you. You're not going to pay legal costs. You don't even have to go to court, except perhaps to show the judge our operating agreement that has a broad indemnification clause. And the judge can look at the operating agreement and say, oh yes, I see that both you human and you LLC, you've both been named in this lawsuit, but clearly the source of this plaintiff's grievance comes from the business, and the operating agreement says whatever we do in connection with the business, that's on me, the LLC, and not on you, the human. The judge can read that and say, yeah, human, you're out. The LLC is the only one who has to defend. And the LLC will be the only one who's on the hook for the judgment from this project. And then that goes back to the corporate veil and all the stuff we talked about. So that's the big one. But it also can help with things like establishing what the human is supposed to do and how the human in the LLC will work. Julia, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm curious if indemnification needs to be written into the operating agreement or if it's just implied. Like, I guess I don't fully understand how to incorporate indemnification in the operating agreements.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk at the end about the resources that we provide, both in the form of educational consults like this, but on a more individualized basis. But also, we can refer people to free legal help, and that would be a perfect example of something that could be done is to revisit or create an operating agreement, working with a lawyer, and they can write the indemnification in nice and broad and very comprehensive. You're right though that the LLC by its very existence offers some of that protection. The indemnification just takes it to the next level, right? By saying it can be written. It can be written however people want it. But usually, a single member LLC is going to say, "I want my LLC to stand between me and the plaintiff for everything, whatever happens in connection with our business, whatever kind of judgment is coming our way, whether it's arising from a regulatory thing, or we've been sued, or we might get sued, or there's some pre-litigation thing going on, like all those things, I want to be protected." Right. And so it's just very explicit about that. What can be very broad.
Okay, so you write in indemnification into the agreement, but then you can broaden it to incorporate the scope that you want it to cover,
Exactly.
which isn't already covered by the limited liability of the LLC.
Right. Limited liability says your personal assets will not be used to satisfy a judgment. It doesn't necessarily get you out of court, though, for example, as an individual. It might, depends on the judge. The indemnification just goes one step further and makes an explicit contractual promise from the business to the person that you person are indemnified against all the things that happen in connection with this business. The way that plays out and the specific ways that could benefit the individual are going to be sort of case by case, but it is a broader and more comprehensive question.
Okay. Thank you for that clarity.
Yeah, it's not exact clarity, really, because it's sort of like, well, but I'm already not on the hook for anything as long as my corporate veil is intact. Yes, I mean, but for example, if we think about plaintiffs, usually are going to come after the business. They're going to come after the owners individually. They're going to come after employees, maybe the janitor, everybody, right? They always sue everybody. That's what plaintiffs lawyers do. And then they let people fall out, during the process of the initial stages of the lawsuit. One thing that indemnity can do is get the individual person out of that courtroom quicker, because they can say, look, whatever happens, I'm out, right? Because I have this broad indemnification. So the LLC is the only one who should be here right now. Shouldn't be me.
Okay.
Before you even consider whether the corporate veil is intact, right? We're not even going into that. We're not going to get into that, because that's really just a question of, okay, now there's a judgment. Somebody owes money. Now who's collectible, right? That happens much later in litigation.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I jump in to add just a quick thing?
Yeah, of course.
Brian mentioned that like before the judge is going to see like the individual sole member of the LLC, but is going to see two people. And that's just fundamentally a critical element to establishing an LLC or a corporation. It is, again, that entity and an operating agreement. Because there are two people, the operating agreement is a contract between the single member or multiple members and each other, and the single member and multiple members and the business itself. And so it's good to have because it fundamentally lays out that relationship and puts into writing that contractual, like, I'm going to do this, you're going to do that kind of situation with a business, even if it's just one person operating a business. That's really helpful. Also, when it comes to closing down a business, because if we're doing all of this work to make something, bring something into being, especially with a single member LLC, when the business closes down, it's not because it's its own entity, it's its own separate thing. It's not that the single owner automatically gets all the assets of the business. And so that's just a note there of just the origin story and then also the conclusion of a business. It's written into the operating agreement and just kind of helps get out or preempt, as Teresa mentioned, like sticky situations.
Yeah, you just brought something up for me, Nick, which is another thing that operating agreements sometimes do in the context of a single member LLC is to think about succession, right? So that's another way of kind of ending the business for one person, but instead of just ending the business outright, what about succession, right? Sometimes that's an issue where it's okay, I'm done running this business, but I want to pass it on to somebody else. The operating agreement can specify some of the ways that that could happen, and maybe even more relevantly for sole single member LLCs, like what happens if I get hit by the proverbial bus tomorrow and I'm in hospital, and I'm not able to run the business for a time. Can someone else step into my shoes and take care of things and make payroll and keep the widgets going out the door or whatever the business needs to do? Well, that can be specified in the operating agreement, right? I'm going to name so-and-so. I'm going to name my brother. That's the person who will step in if I become unavailable. And then the brother-in-law can go to third parties or go to the payroll processor and say, hey, here's the agreement. I'm the guy right now because my sister-in-law is in the hospital and got hit by the proverbial bus. I'm running the show until she comes back, right? So the operating agreement can do that. I'll just bring something up for you.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious about how that translates to like power of attorney. I guess is that more of just like a personal thing? And then the second thing I wanted to ask, oh yeah, was what's the difference between operating agreements and just like memorandums of understanding, like signed memorandums of understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when we think about power of attorney, for example, that's usually going to be a broader thing where it says you get to be me as far as the law is concerned. Sometimes it's limited and sometimes it's general. If it's a general power of attorney, that means you get to be me for all purposes. And that's a pretty big deal, right? Limited powers of attorney can say something more like, well, you get to be me for purpose of running the business. That's another way to do it. And by the way, when we think about succession, that's also going to be part of estate planning for people. And so the estate plan might talk about, okay, the LLC is one of the assets among many others. But that's in the case that the member dies. But so you can still wind up in a tough situation where the member is just incapacitated, right? And so an operating agreement is one forum where those things can be dealt with. But powers of attorney, estate plan, and other things like that can also be used for that purpose. And it's worth mentioning that the owner has to be keeping track of all that stuff. And sometimes the lawyers aren't talking to each other. Sometimes you've got one lawyer who's working on your operating agreement, you've got your estate plan over there, that's a different one. So it's worth it to just keep in mind that business owners should be thinking about how those things interact. And sometimes maybe it makes sense to put your two lawyers in contact with each other, just so that we can make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes.
Okay. And then for the memorandums of understanding versus the operating agreements.
A memorandum of understanding as a general rule is not going to be a legally binding thing, right? That is simply, this is the agreement we're going through. And it outlines the intentions of the party, but doesn't carry much force of law. as a general rule.
It's not legally binding. Memorandums of understanding are not legally binding.
Not usually. Usually something called a memorandum of understanding is basically like a term sheet. It says, like in the financial context, it says this is the outline of a deal we're going to make, but the deal doesn't happen until an agreement is signed.
Which is a contract, I guess.
Yes, agreement, contract, yeah, same word for the same, two different words for the same thing.
Okay. And operating agreements are a contract.
They're a contract between a legal person and the individual, or sometimes the multiple individuals if there's multiple owners.
Okay. Oh, you said a legal person and an individual?
Right. So that goes back to our whole thing of the person versus the entity. So the LLC is a person, the owner is a person. The operating agreement is an agreement between the LLC and the owner. It's funny because in the case of a single member LLC, sometimes they're signed twice by the same person.
Yeah.
Right. But the first signature is I'm signing as me, the human. And the second signature is the business is signing through me as the member. I get to sign for the business. That's one of the other sort of best practices when we think about keeping which hat am I wearing right now. Like when a single member signs the operating agreement, they switch hats, right? So they can wear human hat to start and they say my signature. And then they take the human hat off and put the business hat on. And now it's who am I? Well, now I'm the business. How am I going to sign? I'm going to sign my name, member. And what that means is the business is the one who signed. The business signed through me because the business is just a legal person and doesn't have hands. I do, so I can sign.
Okay. Okay.
It's a weird habit of mine, like we were talking about before, but that's sort of, I think, a really key piece of creating a separation is just starting with that understanding. When I have a business, an LLC or some other corporation, whatever, I've created a different legal person. And so it's about when action is taken, who am I? Am I the human or am I the business? And then acting accordingly.
Okay. No, it's helpful to start framing the mind around it. It's just not necessarily intuitive if you're not approaching it from a necessarily a legal perspective.
For sure. Yeah, which is why we go on about this habit of mind and talk about this sort of weird idea of a new person has been born when an LLC gets created.
Yeah.
Because once you internalize that, it becomes much, much easier to keep things separate and keep things cleanly divided.
I guess how do you approach it before the LLC is created? Because you still have to make investments in your business beforehand. And those often come from your personal accounts, like your sweat equity and or your own personal investment in it. Right. So like before officially registering, you're buying things or you're signing up for softwares or you're doing XYZ to get everything put in place before you get clientele. So how do you approach that scenario?
Another good question. That's another thing that an operating agreement does. It talks about capital contributions. So a typical operating agreement says, I, the human, am providing you, the business, with this money and these assets. That can be done other ways too, but it's commonly done in an operating agreement. It says, business, you need $5,000 to get started because you're going to go off and sign a lease and you're going to go buy some stuff. I'm giving you the 5,000, and that's memorialized in the operating agreement. So the seed money or the stuff that's being transferred to the business in order to get it going is right there, usually on a schedule at the end of the agreement. And if there's multiple members, they'll all specify what they brought to the table. And if there's sweat equity, they can put a number on it.
Okay. So you're just supposed to like basically put a lump sum into a business account and not like and not, I guess, make it purchases from your individual account.
That's the best practice for sure, right? So like,
You
how does
can't
it
start
look
a
in
business
practice?
account. So sorry. I just
Yeah.
want to, can't start a business account without registering the business, right? Because you don't have the EIN.
Right. Yeah. So let's go through that timeline real quick, because I think it's helpful, right? Where we say, okay, I'm going to start a new business. I'm going to do my landscaping thing. And so how does it go? Usually the business owner is going to start by just doing stuff, right? But the sort of best way to go, or the cleanest way to do this would be go to Secretary of State, create LLC. That's easy. It's called the Articles of Organization, and it's just an online form at the Secretary of State where you pick a name and fill out some other stuff, and the LLC is born. Create operating agreement and infuse capital into the company at that time. Go get an EIN number from the IRS. That's again, just an online thing. Just go to the IRS. If you Google IRS EIN or whatever, it'll pop right up. And that's like the analog is a social security number, right? So all the humans get social security numbers when we were born. That's used for tax purposes, right? The IRS knows us by our social security numbers. When an LLC gets born, it gets an EIN. Same thing, right? So it's a different number. Then the EIN number, once received, can be taken to the bank, and the business can open a bank account. And the money that was infused on the day the operating agreement was signed, that gets deposited into the bank account. Now the business has a bank account with money in it that it can use to go out and buy the truck and the mower and the trailer and all the things, and you're off and running. By the way, you also need to go, if you're in Vermont, you need to register with Vermont tax authorities, which is just my VTAX stuff. Yeah, my VTAX on the
Sorry, Brian, would you mind repeating that last part about the taxes? It just didn't come through clearly to me.
The Vermont tax piece?
Yeah, yes, please.
Yeah, it's my VTax. It's just another registration. So there's the IRS registration on the one hand that gives you an EIN number and sort of puts you on the radar from the perspective of the federal taxing authorities. And it's like a social security number that can be used for other things. But then there's the state tax is also a thing for businesses. So that's my VTax dot, I think it's I don't know, it's just my VTAX. If you Google that, it'll come up. You register there just like you would do with the IRS.
Okay. And what
So
is it that you were
point.
specifically, sorry,
Go ahead.
what is it that you're specifically registering at the Vermont Tax Department if you're an LLC?
The existence of the LLC. You're saying Vermont, an LLC was born, and here's its identity, right? And then Vermont can say, okay, cool, like we'll keep track of that. It will be paying taxes to the state, just like the person would do.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So if you haven't done all of that and you've already paid for business expenses from your personal account, is there anything you can do? Like I've just kept receipts and been like, I paid from this from my like personal account and see receipts.
Operating agreements can be put in place later. And so the task then becomes sort of looking back and thinking, all right, well, what money have I already put into this business? Let's tally it up. Let's make a list. And then that stuff just ends up in the operating agreement.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Better late than never. And yeah, to any of you out there who already have LLCs and don't have operating agreements, you are in the 99%. So don't despair. It's super, super common.
Thanks so much.
Work here today.
Thank you for answering my questions.
All right, yeah, we knew operating agreements would be a big one. All right, so who are we? We're still with you, Teresa.
Yes.
let's talk about nonprofits. I don't know, maybe someone can put in the chat if a nonprofit is of interest. We'll cover this regardless, but we'll go into a little more perhaps detail if anyone is thinking of starting a nonprofit. I didn't see anyone in the chat who was.
I think
So-
Yulia actually expressed interest.
Oh,
So,
really? Okay, good. Well,
and
then
we have,
let's get into it.
yeah, we do have 3 slides. So we're going to go through all this information pretty quickly. And then if there are questions, we might ask for them at the end, but there's a lot to get through.
Okay, we've got another one, Yulia
And Nora.
both.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
Okay.
We've got an audience here.
All right. So a nonprofit, which we kind of introed earlier, is created to provide a social service. It renders something to the community: hospitals, schools, clubs, libraries, charities. By definition, it's in contrast to the for-profit because it's not for profit. The structure of a nonprofit has a board of directors. And since we were talking about the limited liability protection for other business entities, there is some limited liability protection to the directors and officers. Nonprofits have the tax exempt status, which we've talked a little bit about, and donations are generally tax exempt, but that's only if the nonprofit follows the filing and reporting requirements. And those are, I don't want to say constant, but they are regular, and it's a lot. It was in that high threshold of government oversight that we saw on the Business Entities 101 slide. A nonprofit is a type of corporation or organization, but it still needs to follow regulatory requirements of the industry. So for example, a food shelf would still need to comply with food safety rules. Sometimes an idea for a way to give back to the community can start as a selfless act and then becomes the idea for a nonprofit, but it's important to know all that's required for a nonprofit before getting in too deep. So before starting a nonprofit, it's key to plan around the mission. This is a huge factor. In the food shelf scenario, a food shelf would find it very difficult if they wanted to get into hospital type services, and that's a very different mission. I think we had a question earlier about how a nonprofit can get into some tax liability, and a nonprofit might create a taxable situation for itself if they take income for activities outside of their mission. It's also important to research the many forms beforehand. The filing process is extensive and lengthy, and there are documents at both the state and federal levels that, again, will come in at different times. Sometimes it's biannual reports at the state and at different levels, so the timelines are not always easy to keep track of. We talked a little bit about taxation, and just generally for nonprofits, it's probably a good idea to either get a lawyer and an accountant on board, or at least have some good friends who are lawyers and accountants to help get started. All right, so Nick, I think you're covering the next slide.
I am. Thank you, Teresa. So what this looks like in a more concrete fashion is like the purpose of this little thing. And I'm going to try and go through it quickly because, again, a lot of government interest in making sure that a nonprofit is actually living up to its mission because there's that great benefit of tax exempt status. So the formalities really matter. We talked a little bit about corporations, where corporations have to have a board of directors, they have officers. Like when you think of a CFO or a CEO, there we go. That's the one that I'm thinking of. Chief Executive Officer, Chief Financial Officer. You may not have those titles for a nonprofit, but those roles are still occupied. There's still like an executive director of a nonprofit. There's still someone who looks over the finances, things of that nature. And so there's a lot more technical components to that. So with these technical components, certain formalities have to be upheld. So naming the structures, naming how many board members, how many officers, things like that in the corporate document, similar to the operating agreement. I'm blanking on the name of the corporate agreement. Brian, can you? The bylaws. Thank you. Oh my gosh, yeah. That's so silly. But also, so having the bylaws, having things like it's termed bylaws because for the internal organization, those are the laws, and for the organization itself. So establishing separate bank accounts. When it comes to a nonprofit, it's important to know that the people who run the nonprofit are not the owners of the nonprofit. The nonprofit belongs to the public. And that's another delineation. It's a little bit abstract, but because a nonprofit is to serve a public purpose, if it's charitable, if it's scientific, what have you, it's owned by the public, the taxpayers, essentially, because of that tax exempt status. When you think of it as a system, it plays that specific role there. And there are necessary filings with the state and with the IRS in particular to show who makes the most money in the nonprofit, how much money is the nonprofit taking in, and what is it doing with that money, other than paying out, as we've mentioned before, a reasonable salary for the people who are working there. And because it belongs to the public, it's like any additional income has to go back into the nonprofit and not into the pockets of the directors or the officers or employees of the nonprofit. There are additional Vermont laws and rules. So what nonprofits oftentimes have employees. Employees come with benefits and certain workers' comp, unemployment protections in the case that like COVID-19 happened. A lot of people were benefiting from having unemployment with their nonprofit jobs. There are a lot of people who did not have unemployment because nonprofits didn't quite protect their workers as employees as they should have. There are also protections against discrimination in employment law. Sales and other taxes. I think, Yulia, you might have asked in the chat about other tax liability for nonprofits. So property taxes, to the best of my understanding, if a nonprofit holds property, in Vermont, property taxes are still, they still exist for nonprofits. There might be some exemptions. So getting to know your town, getting to know the clerk who works at the town can be really helpful in navigating what requirements exist from like property taxes. And then for charitable purposes, like a nonprofit, like a lot of them have to do with taking care of children. Like I want to set up a summer camp for children to help them learn and grow, especially with children, or like after school programs, camps, summer camps and after school programs working with children. There are a lot of licensing requirements that go along with it. And because like regardless of if it's for profit or nonprofit, these licensing requirements still exist. So being aware of what additional registration and licensing is entailed with the industry that the nonprofit is interested in serving. There are ways to convert entities from one entity to another, because oftentimes starting an enterprise, starting an idea, a business, it changes over time. So there is some flexibility depending on kind of which direction you're going towards. So if you're a for-profit trying to go towards a nonprofit, so if you're an LLC, you're trying to shift more into the nonprofit space and become a nonprofit, part of that operating agreement of your LLC should outline how to wind up the LLC to close it down so it can actually shift into a nonprofit status. From a nonprofit moving to a for-profit, sorry, I had that completely mixed up. For profit going to nonprofit, it's a little bit easier. And like the successor disclosures, I said the operating agreement will have winding up notions. That's winding up is kind of like the end of a for-profit entity. When it comes from going to a nonprofit, you don't have to wind up the LLC. You just have to go through the operating agreement and then shift into registering with the IRS, registering, shifting the designation with the Secretary of State, things like that. For a nonprofit to go to a for-profit, my understanding is that the nonprofit needs to close because there are certain assets that might be available, and then a new entity, a for-profit, is formed.
Yeah, and in that case, one of the restrictions on nonprofits is because they can't distribute money, right? They can pay salaries. They can't be like, good quarter for the nonprofit, everybody gets a bonus, right? That's not how that's distributing profits, right? They don't get to do that because they don't make profits. If they wind up the business, then one of the promises a nonprofit organization makes to the IRS is that all of the assets, whatever may remain in the nonprofit organization, have to be either donated to another nonprofit that's similarly situated or to the government. So the assets cannot travel from a nonprofit to a for-profit organization. It's possible to have a nonprofit wind it up and then create a for-profit organization that stands in its stead. But basically what's happening there is they're just making a whole new thing and the money can't move. Go on.
That's all I had for
Yeah.
for that, unless we wanted.
Yeah, before we get into hybrid entities, because that's next, we're going to talk about some of the alternatives to nonprofits. I'll just highlight a little bit of this nonprofit stuff. So for anyone interested out there, the form you have to file with the IRS to create a public charity is called 1023. There's also one called a 1023 EZ, which is sort of like a 1040, has the EZ form for people whose personal income tax situation is relatively simple. The 1023 EZ form is for nonprofits that are trying to establish themselves at the IRS, and their situation is simple. But creating and maintaining a nonprofit, as we've been saying, is not an easy thing to do because we have to have a board. And as we say at the bottom of this slide, we have to watch out for this idea about private enrollment. So basically what private enrollment means, it's the bad thing we may not do. And it is when an insider receives a benefit from the nonprofit as a result of their position as insider. So the rules around private enrollment can get very, very sticky and quite challenging quite easily. An illustration of this. Imagine that the nonprofit owns a vehicle, right? It's a summer camp and it has a vehicle that it uses to ferry kids back and forth. Okay, all fine and good, right? The vehicle is registered to the nonprofit. The nonprofit as an entity is the owner of that vehicle. But then one of the directors of the nonprofit, who also works at the camp, says, hey, like that vehicle sits all day when the kids are at camp, but I've got to go pick my kid up from daycare and bring him over. I'm just going to take the nonprofit vehicle and use it to go pick up the kid. And everyone else is like, yeah, fine, great, I love it. It's just going to be sitting there anyway until 3 o'clock when all the other kids go home. So take it. No, we got a problem. That's a private enrollment. Now you have one of the directors of the nonprofit organization using the vehicle, getting that benefit. That doesn't have to be money, it can be any benefit. They're an insider getting a benefit in the form of the use of that vehicle for their personal gain. And they're getting that because they're an insider. That's a private enrollment. It's a problem. And if the IRS gets wind of it, they're not going to be happy, right? And all kinds of problems can arise. Now, is it possible for the director to use the vehicle and pick up their kid? Sure. But how does that have to happen? An arm's length transaction has to occur. Oh, you want to use the vehicle? Cool. We'll rent it to you. You get to use it for an hour every day to go pick up your kid and bring them back to the camp. And you're going to pay us for that purpose at a fair market value. right? Because the nonprofit isn't allowed to do things that aren't part of its mission. And picking up your kids from daycare isn't part of its charitable mission, right? And so it can rent you the vehicle, but that has to be like an arm's length transaction where there's a fair market value being exchanged. The nonprofit received the money that you're giving me to it to rent the vehicle, right? So it's like this whole thing that has to happen. And by the way, the director who's doing that thing, who wants to use the vehicle, they can't vote on that because they have a conflict of interest. So you need to have enough other directors who can vote on this agreement that the nonprofit is going to rent the vehicle to you for an hour ago. You can get a quorum and you can vote on that and make it a thing. So that's just an example of how things can really get tough because the nonprofit is so heavily restricted to doing things that are within its mission, and it can only do those things. Any questions on nonprofit stuff? We're going to move on to sort of, if we've scared you enough about nonprofits, we can talk about some of the other things that are out there for people who still want to have a mission-focused business, but don't want to necessarily go to all the trouble of creating and maintaining their own nonprofit organization. Everyone's terrified. Let's move on.
All right.
Please.
Yes, hybrid entities. And this isn't to necessarily scare folks away from nonprofits, but rather, really provide a sober presentation of just like how difficult nonprofits can be, and how much risk is involved in establishing a nonprofit. So they take a lot of intentionality, just to say that. There are some entity structures that allow for some public benefit and also personal benefits of being able to make a little bit of extra money from that. And we've been talking about nonprofits and for-profits, and a question we've received is just why can't I do good and also make money? And the American legal system and business law, the notion is that business is to make money, not to do good. The state does good, nonprofits or charities do good, but business makes money. There is a movement to kind of, unite that notion to do good, make money, kind of, be able to do both to a certain degree. And so in Vermont, not in every state, but in Vermont, there is a thing called a low profit limited liability company. It's L3C. It is essentially an LLC with a specific provision that says, okay, you don't have to maximize profits. You can provide some public benefit as well. So you can make low profits. There is an expectation that some of those profits go into doing good. And what that looks like from the Secretary of State perspective is if you're setting up an L3C, there is also a stated mission that goes along with that entity saying, I have a cafe and I want to set up a cafe, but I also want to be able to provide some low cost or no cost meals, and have that reflected and not be held liable because I'm not like making as much money as I can, or doing the best for the business, as it were, because giving things away for free is not necessarily best business practice. So there is that allowance within Vermont to have a low profit LLC. There's also benefit corporations. Not every state, again, has like legal protections for benefit corporations. I'm sure folks here have heard about like B Corp certification. They're two separate things that work together, essentially. And so a benefit corporation is exactly what we've been talking about with corporations and nonprofit corporations. They have very high levels of reporting and formalities, but part of the mission of the corporation is to provide a benefit of some sort. Most states require a third-party certification, which is where B Corp status comes in. And that's an additional form, that's additional logistics, but it can be helpful to protect a company from, shareholders saying like, you didn't do everything to make me money. I gave you money. I purchased stock in your company. I am a shareholder. For benefit corporation, it allows it. There's a defense saying like, yes, we didn't make as much money as we could have, but it's because we helped the environment in some way. We helped with social governance some way. We did some good. And then there are cooperative models, which I don't think anyone has listed or vocalized too much of an interest in co-ops. So I'm just going to name that there are different types of co-ops that are also fairly complicated, similar to the complications of, not complications, but like intricacies of corporations. And it's really helpful to get to know an accountant for co-ops in particular. There are three main types of co-ops: consumer, worker, and producer co-ops. And I think time doesn't quite allow to go into it. So just want to share that there are cooperative models out there that can help provide personal inurement, like personal gain, and also provide a greater benefit.
Yeah, so we are at time, Cindy, and we've got a few more slides we could cover, and I don't know what everybody's schedules look like. I've got a few extra minutes. I'm happy to stick around, but I also want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I don't know where we at there. Do we call it, or do you want to stick on for another little bit and talk about a few things?
Brian, I'm able to stay on. I think it's practical to finish the presentation if you're okay doing so. This will have a second life online, so that way folks down the line can see the full presentation.
Sounds good.
Great.
Teresa and Nick, if you're able to stay, feel free. If not, that's okay. I'll cover these last slides. So drop off if you need to, but if you want to stick around, feel free. Starting with risk and liability. Nick, do you want to cover it, or do you have to go?
I can stay. I'm happy to stay.
Sure.
So yes, we're really getting into like very pertinent information here of risk and liability. Like, why do you need a corporate veil? Why do you want some protection from your personal life against like business liabilities? Well, talking about risk and liability, kind of to provide an overview of what liability is. Liability is oftentimes debt, or like I am held liable to a contract that I have, or my business rather is held liable to a contract that it has. There are other types of liability, which I realize I'm kind of going in a scattered capacity here, but like there are multiple forms of liability. And insurance is an excellent way of kind of covering that liability to provide an additional cushion for the people who own a business or the person who owns their business. So insurance for general liability, general liability is not necessarily like anything that the business is doing. It's, a sidewalk is a little bit extra slippery one day and someone falls outside of my establishment. Well, I have insurance to help protect my company from any suit if the person who slipped decides to sue for their slip to help like get damages if they were injured or something of the like. So general liability insurance kind of covers that. Professional liability insurance covers, as the slide says, errors or omissions or negligence in performing professional services. So professional liability insurance applies to lawyers who are licensed, social workers who are licensed. The insurance kind of corresponds with the roles, responsibilities, and duties that correspond with the license that someone holds. There's also workers' compensation for employees who are injured at work at the establishment and doing the job at their work. That's always really helpful to have because employees, especially in a small business context, are crucial to the well-being of the small business. And if anything should happen, it's really helpful not only for the employee, but for the business to have some sort of coverage for those employees. And then product liability. Product liability is for injuries like that come from products that are made and sold by the business. And so if there's a some sort of what is it? Sorry, my words are escaping me today.
Like a defect or something like that.
Sorry?
Like a defect in a product.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Then insurance can also cover that. And so a lot of small business owners are reluctant to get insurance because it's just another cost. But the thing is, insurance helps with that risk calculation of how much is my business going to be opened up to risk and liability if I don't have insurance, and how much, like, how brave am I? And how audacious am I in my business relationships. Insurance is always recommended, simply because it can help in those sticky situations.
Okay. We'll skip over the scenario and we can talk about that if people have questions, just in the interest of time. Let's talk about reporting. Teresa, I think you're on tech level.
Sure, yes. So as we've touched upon, different entities, LLCs, LLPs, corporations, nonprofits, all have different requirements. The Secretary of State can provide is a good resource for looking for different requirements at the state level, but different entities might have different reporting and filing requirements at federal levels or with different regulating bodies. Some things to be aware of for overall structure, and again, thinking about the separation of self from the business and keeping them clear. Does my business need to have an annual meeting? Even if I'm a single member LLC, meeting with myself and having something on the books is going to be key to make sure that we're checking that box for the regulating bodies, for the government, and fulfilling that requirement. There are different cadences for filing and reporting. Again, Secretary of State's website will be helpful for knowing if it's an annual report, if there are biannual filings. And so it'll be, so making sure that the business is staying in good standing based on these different requirements as well. There are, like we mentioned, regulations, licensing and permitting things to think through. So whether it's making modifications to a building for the business, going through zoning, getting proper permitting for making those improvements. There's also specific licensing for different niche industries. I know that one that kind of surprised me was there's a precious metals permit that certain businesses need to have. And so if I were going to go into making handmade jewelry, is that something I need to pursue? So really looking into the specifics of the small business and making sure that permits are being pursued. Also paying attention to the renewals of the licensing. Some are annual again, but knowing the recurring cadence there. Will there be inspections of the business, of the premises, and what will those entail? Insurance policies, which we've talked about a little bit, keeping track of the premiums, and again, where is the premium payment coming out of if the business account is set up, making sure it's being withdrawn accurately there. What events or business additions would require an update to a policy? Some important questions to ask throughout business moving forward. Tax filings, so the sole proprietor or partnership gets reported on the personal taxpayer number versus the business EIN. And the first year filings might be a little tricky. So again, knowing beforehand once a business is set up and registered with the state, putting things on a calendar can be a super helpful way to stay on top of when these reports and filings need to occur. Also super important to revisit agreements and outstanding obligations. So are there recurring debts? Are vendors or suppliers still holding up their end of the bargain? Are the agreements still being met and valid? Some important things for a small business to keep in mind. And I don't know that we have time to talk about the scenario of a nonprofit childcare center, but given what we talked about for nonprofits, there's also a whole separate regulating body for childcare in specific. in particular rather. So I think there's a 78-page document that a childcare center will need to know in addition to everything we talked about for nonprofits. So yeah, I'll turn it back over to you, Brian.
Yeah, and the nonprofit childcare center was a good one because I think it hits every bullet point on the slide. You know, it's a corporation, so it needs an annual meeting. It's going to have annual reporting for the IRS and filings. Childcare, so lots of regulatory stuff, plenty of inspection obligations. Definitely insurance policies are probably mandatory and certainly a good idea. Right, the tax filings are another IRS obligation, and then whatever other agreements. So that was one of it's all the maps. Okay, our last substantive slide goes to you. Doing business with friends.
So we are kind of picking up from exactly where we started. You have an enterprise, you have an idea, you have like some really cool thing that you and your friends want to do. Like, what do you do? Some things to keep in mind is that a partnership is kind of the default when two people or more get into actually applying their dreams and making it into a reality. And so the partnership default that, as Brian mentioned before, like there are laws like statutes in place that if there isn't a partnership agreement and something goes wrong, the state goes like, hey, this is how you deal with it for the benefit mostly of the taxpayer and the state itself. Likewise, there are statutory provisions for LLCs in the case that an LLC doesn't have an operating agreement. Again, that's one of the additional reasons to have a partnership agreement or an operating agreement for kind of these low to medium reporting requirement type business structures is to write terms that are favorable to the owners and the business as well. The operating agreement for doing business with friends says like John provided this much money and Josephine provided this much labor, like recipes for the business, like the sweat equity of another friend who's a carpenter who actually built the structure. Operating agreement kind of enumerates and lists and describes the different types of labor that are put in between John, Josephine, and we'll just call him Carpenter. And it helps people literally get on the same page so that there is a mutual understanding of exactly what goes in, what happens, how we meet, how we communicate, and what happens if, you know, things get sticky, sour, or something happens to the business itself that's beyond our actions. The operating agreement provides that guideline and the literal pages for people to mutually look over. It also covers the sharings of profits and losses. Oftentimes when friends get together because they have a really great idea, these things aren't really talked about. It's like, oh yeah, we'll split it half, or we'll split it 3 ways, or something of the like. It's important, kind of awkward, especially with friends, but fundamentally important to write things down because sometimes things can get lost in translation. Like that's a pretty easy and casual way to put it. It's like things get lost in translation, but also sometimes when money is involved, it goes beyond getting lost in translation and really just comes down to just different principles and disagreements and everything. So it's really super helpful and important to have an operating agreement, especially when folks want to get into a business with friends or with a spouse or with family, because there's these assumptions that like, oh, it's all going to work out because we're in the good times. Well, operating agreement helps when the good times are no longer good or not always good, but you know, in the bad times as well. Fundamentally, it's just important to be deliberate about the setup of a business, of just like, it's not necessarily a casual thing. A sole proprietorship can be a casual thing. It doesn't come with any protections and like inherent protections against liabilities. So it's afforded that casual nature, and partnerships as well afforded those casual, more organic natures. But when it comes to LLCs and corporations, nonprofits, L3Cs, all of these different entities that we've talked about, they're not as casual because they have more protections, which means that there's just more intentionality that need to go behind them for them to be successful and for folks to actually, benefit from the business and pursue their dream or their venture. I think that's what I have, Brian.
Okay. Yeah, so we've had lots of back and forth, which is awesome. I'm glad that everybody has been so involved, and thank you all for that. Right, just a few things to leave you with. Obviously, the legal structure matters, right? Sole proprietorships and partnerships are sort of inherently risky. They're easy and they're the default, but other legal structures that are more deliberate can make a lot of sense. And before we lose Yulia, here in this, you'll have access to these slides. What can you do to put some of this into practice? You can come to us at the Small Business Law Center. How do you do that? With that QR code right there. So what that does is it brings you to a form where you can fill out to get legal help that's specific to your situation. Now, the way it works is we can do an educational consult where we sort of dive deep on whatever is going on for you and your business. And we can give you information that's specific to whatever your needs are. But in that forum, we won't be doing legal advice. However, we can connect you to a lawyer who can give you specific legal advice. So what we can do in the educational context is tell you how it works, like we've been doing here today, but specific to your questions. And then we can get you referred to an attorney who can tell you what you should do, the advice part, right? Or get the thing done for you, like creating an operating agreement, or a different kind of agreement, or reviewing a lease, or helping you set up a nonprofit. Whatever it is that you're trying to do, that's where the attorney role comes in. So thanks everybody for coming today. And we really appreciated this group and how active you were. So Simeon, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brian. And just to clarify, with the services available through the Vermont Small Business Law Center, folks can get up to 10 hours of free business legal assistance. Is that correct? I guess I'm seeing that at the bottom of the slide
Yeah,
here.
thank you. Yeah, we like to sort of drive that point home, right?
Yeah.
You get 10 hours of attorney help and it's no cost to you. So we pay the attorney what's called a low bono rate, right? So it's not pro bono, it's not free service. The attorney is getting paid. It's not a normal rate, but it's better than nothing. And we have a pretty wide network of attorneys who are happy to do this kind of work. So whatever it is you're trying to get done, chances are we've got somebody in our network who can help you do it.
Yeah, it's a great service. I've encouraged and connected lots of the folks I work with to it. So I'm so glad it's available to folks. It was really a missing component in the small business community. Of course, I'd like to find the equivalent from an accounting perspective. That's the other half of the coin, too, for folks. But I'll continue to push for that and see what eventually happens. So, but thank you so much for sharing all of your information today. I just had one quick question, Brian. I don't know if you know, but you had mentioned that the Vermont tax to register your LLC. You don't happen to know off the top of your head like what the form is, do you?
To register a new LLC, it can be done with a form, but it is almost always done online.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And it's done through the Secretary of State Corporations Division. You can probably just find by Googling. And one of the options there is to register a new business. And basically, it's just like a form. It's kind of passed through it. There might be a few questions along the way where attorney help might be useful.
Okay.
But most people can make their way through the form. And then the LLC is created, right? The legal person's been born.
Yeah.
But as we've said, that's not the end of the inquiry. Best to get an operating agreement and do some other stuff. The state does not require that, though. For the state, it's just
Oh, okay. So the Vermont tax form that you spoke about, it's not
the tax registration.
the tax
That's
form.
for LLCs that have already been created.
Yeah.
And it's not super complicated. That's like another sort of online widget, right?
Okay.
You go to myvtax.com or whatever it is, I think it's .com. And look for a business registration. And we'll just go through.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your presentation today, all of you. It was great information, really helpful. Of course, it's going to be new for just about everybody, and so I think a practical step would be, of course, for folks to consider connecting with your program, or if they're working with an attorney, to kind of build out their knowledge and get some specific help in these areas. Would that make sense, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. We're here for all Vermont small businesses.
Okay.
So, yeah, by all means, if you've gotten to the end of this and think, oh, I've got some stuff I need to do, come talk to us. We'll have to do it.
Great. Thank you. And I want to thank Sophia for handling all the behind the scenes things to pull off these classes. So thank you, Sophia. I really appreciate all your help. I couldn't do it without you. Wouldn't want to either, but thank you. And Sophia, I know you're going to be emailing folks a recording of this class and various information that was provided at the beginning and throughout. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, I'll shoot to have that email out tomorrow.
Great. Sophia, is there just in the interest of upcoming classes, is there another class we want to mention on here that's coming up for us, or are we still waiting on some details?
We do have a business plan writing class coming up on May 29th, I believe. It's going to be from 10 a.m. to noon, and it will be in Burlington at the 255 Champlain office of CVOEO. So in person, if you have a business plan that you would like reviewed during that session, I can throw the registration link on the follow-up email, and
Oh,
you
that'd
can
be
upload
great.
it there.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Nicole, Brian, and Teresa. Thanks for staying over. Really appreciate all your time.
Thanks for having us, and always
Thank
fun
you.
for your partner with CB.